This video is titled The Neurobiology of Change. It's designed to explain with visual aids the process by which changes in thinking occur in the human brain. For many, probably most, the process of change is frustrating and elusive. This probably is best characterized by the common lament, "I know better, but I do it anyway." As in, I know better than to eat that donut, but I did it anyway. When you're done watching this video, you will know why you did it anyway, and better yet, how to not eat that donut if you don't want to eat it. This particular video is designed to accompany the weight loss series. Thus, the examples are tailored to the thinking that drives overeating. But keep in mind that this process applies to changing any form of thinking. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, take some notes, and enjoy the show. This first slide is a diagram depicting the cells in the human brain called neurons. The inset picture shows a close-up of the smallest unit of thought, a synapse. Synapses are actually microscopic spaces between the dendrite protrusions of one neuron and the receptor sites of an adjacent neuron. Synapses are where everything connected to thought happens. Each individual synapse functions as a storage and a retrieval mechanism that functions like a dynamic biological microswitch. It's estimated that the human brain has the capacity to form 500 trillion of these microswitches, or synapses. To put that into perspective, one human brain has the capacity to form more microswitches than all of the computers in the world combined, including cell phones. That's pretty amazing. Every time a human being thinks a thought, roughly 10,000 new synapses are formed. Even if it's the same thought that has been cycled many times, it still produces 10,000 brand new microswitches. So, not only do our thoughts matter, but they become matter, literally. Every thought produces new matter, new microswitches that strengthen the concept or the idea. Thus, the strength of a thought, an idea, or a belief is literally measured by the number of times it has been thought. In addition, each time a neuron is fired, a hormone called neural growth factor is released into the system that causes the neuron to sprout new dendrites, poised and ready to connect the next time that neuron is fired. This is an actual picture of some real neurons. The very reason that we can say with certainty that these things are happening is because we can now take pictures of them and watch them in action. Now, this has only been in the last 20 to 25 years that we've been able to actually observe neuroplasticity. With the advent of CAT scans, PET scans, and especially functional MRIs, we can now peer inside the human brain. And we've only had that computing power for a relatively short period of time. And it's significant to note that prior to having this machinery, scientists believed that these things could not happen. So this is pretty new stuff. This slide is the first in a series of slides that show how changes happen at the neurobiological level in the brain. This slide represents one neuron connecting to an adjacent neuron, that lone yellow line. Now, I've labeled the receiving neuron as a member of the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain responsible for surviving. And when it comes to food, this part of the brain will do anything to gain and retain precious fat reserves. It comes pre-wired to make sure that we take in food whenever it is available. It doesn't like the idea of burning fat for fuel. This is counter to the idea of survival. The system in the brain launches our get fat and stay fat thinking. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, this lone yellow line represents one thought. Now, in reality, one thought creates tens of thousands of these connections, but for simplicity's sake, this will represent one thought. And I'm going to designate this as our default thought. And that thought will be, I don't care. As in, I'm just going to go ahead and eat this donut because I don't care. It just doesn't matter. Now I chose this default thought because it is a very prominent thought that my clients often use to make it okay to eat something that they know they shouldn't. To me, it also represents the quintessential default thought in that it nicely represents the very illogical nature of thought in our brains. Of course we care. If we didn't care, we wouldn't be watching this tape. But yet, in that very moment, as we're eyeing that donut or piece of pizza or whatever, we're able to slide that logical thinking aside just long enough to shove the donut in, and then, afterwards, of course we care. Then comes the guilt, the shame, the self-loathing, and the I am just a big failure thinking. It's not so important to know where these thoughts originated, but rather to recognize that somewhere along the line our brains picked them up as a convenient way to give permission to eat that donut, even when we know we shouldn't. As new thoughts occur, dendrites grow and form new connections with multiple adjacent neurons. Each new connection forms a synapse, that tiny space between a dendrite and the adjacent neuron. Each new thought forms an additional 10,000 new synapses. It is in this electrochemically configured synapse that memory is housed. This process is known as neuroplasticity. Scientists generally agree that we entertain something on the order of 100,000 thoughts per day. That's a huge number. And throughout the course of a day, a week, or a lifetime, that really starts to add up. As the process of thinking new thoughts occurs, more and more connections are being made. A typical healthy human brain houses some 100 billion nerve cells, which are connected to one another via hundreds of trillions of synapses. Each synapse functions like a tiny microprocessor, and tens of thousands of them can connect a single neuron to other nerve cells. In the cerebral cortex alone, there are roughly 125 trillion synapses. That is about how many stars fill 1,500 Milky Way galaxies. We're talking about some huge numbers. Each cubic millimeter of cerebral cortex contains roughly 1 billion synapses. The adult human brain, again, is estimated to contain the capacity to form 500 trillion of these synapses. By the time we're done with this presentation, each one of us will have created several million new synapses just to process, catalog, and remember what we've heard on this video. That's a lot of cognitive horsepower. Yet most of us are doing very little to control it. If we're going to get good at managing our eating behaviors, we simply have to get good at managing this process. On this slide, the red arrow indicates where a distinct pathway is beginning to form as a thought or set of thoughts is repeated. It could be one dominant thought that is repeated all the time, or a combination of thoughts, a thought pattern, if you will. We call this thought pattern or pathway a perspective. Let's say my perspective is, I just don't care. And of course, all of its little cousins, just go ahead and eat it. It's not that big a deal. It doesn't matter anyway. I can skip lunch, or I can work this off tomorrow. Everyone's doing it. It's a celebration. Live a little. Go ahead and celebrate. If this is my perspective, then when I'm faced with a decision about what to eat and how much to eat, I am far more likely to choose poorly and to overeat. And each time I think this way, I'm literally strengthening this perspective, 10,000 synapses at a time. The more I use this way of thinking, the stronger the pathway or the perspective gets. Over time, this repeated thought pattern establishes what we call a default pathway. I like to think of these individual thoughts as cognitive footprints, and they're forming a default pathway. We now have a default perspective that practically ensures that we will continue to make poor food choices and or eat too much. By the time an adult is in his or her 40s, that person has made food choices roughly 70,000 times or more. Now multiply that by the likely number of thoughts involved, times the number of individual synapses comprising those thoughts, and we're easily into the billions. That represents a very robust default circuit that supports the thinking that we no longer want to have. And if firing this circuit involves the release of dopamine, which we know that eating does, the circuit becomes quite strong. Dopamine is like fertilizer to these pathways. But before we go any further, we have to understand a critical aspect of the human brain. It has canceling properties. Just like sound waves, two thoughts that are 180 degrees out of phase cancel each other out. We cannot just decide to stop thinking the unwanted thoughts. That will never work. The human brain simply doesn't work that way. Rather, we have to design thoughts that are exactly 180 degrees out of phase with the existing thoughts that we're attempting to change, and we have to start thinking these new thoughts. Another term for this aspect is mutual exclusivity, meaning one or the other, but not both at the same time. In other words, I cannot think I don't care and I do care at the same time. I cannot think it doesn't matter and it does matter at the same time. My brain must choose one or the other. And it chooses based on signal strength. Which thought has been thought the most? That's simply the way it works. This aspect of the brain is really the brain's security system. It works this way to ensure that we don't accidentally delete a program that could crash the entire system. Now take notice of the colors on this slide. The yellow line represents the default thoughts, the ones we've been talking about, and the red line represents the thoughts that we are about to construct, these new ones that will be 180 degrees out of phase with the old. This slide indicates the very beginning of cognitive editing, constructing these new opposite phase thoughts. The lone red connection on this slide indicates a mutually exclusive thought that we must be thinking instead of the default thought. Notice that this thought is connecting to a different neuron, one that is a member of the cortex system. The cerebral cortex, the cortex system, is where we form logic and reason and process mega amounts of information. Motor skills, language skills, auditory and visual input, all are processed in the cerebral cortex system. To make the change happen, we have to fully engage this cortex system. This red line represents the thought, I do care. I care a lot. My health is very important to me, instead of that old default, I don't care. Or, this is a priority. I will make time, instead of the old default, I just don't have time. Or, overeating deprives me of the wonderful feeling of being in control, instead of I'm feeling deprived by not being able to eat more. Or, there is no tomorrow. Tomorrow doesn't exist. I'm going to do this now. Instead of, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll start again on Monday. Now at this point, this new thought is just a fledgling. No match for the default pathway. So this new thought, even though it is far more logical and intellectually fits our purpose is really no match for the default perspective. Our thoughts will still be channeled down that default pathway. That's how our brains really work. They follow a path of least resistance. It's the law of physics. There's no getting around it. This is why I can know better, but I can still do it anyway. But as we keep repeating this new thought, the new circuit begins to grow. This is achieved by actually thinking that new thought. Remember, each time we think the new thought, our brains secrete neural growth factor to stimulate new growth of this new circuit. The circuit literally has to be fired over and over again to gain signal strength. We can accelerate this process, but only by so much. We're governed by math, by chemistry, and by physics. Terminal velocity is the term I give to the maximum speed at which we can create new synapses, and this process simply cannot be short-circuited. The red circuit contains our logical thought, but it's important to know that logic does not trump physics. At this stage, the individual knows better and is trying desperately to eat better, but continues to keep overeating. It's a very frustrating place to be. And we cannot circumvent this stage with willpower or motivation. This is the neurobiological explanation for what we call lack of willpower. It's not really that. It's just that physics trumps our willpower or our motivation. Physics trumps logic. Now, we might be able to send some of our thoughts up that red pathway sometimes with great effort, but ultimately the yellow circuit will win in that decision battle because of physics. Now, the first thing you'll notice on this slide is a much thicker red line. The thicker red line represents an amplified thought. Fortunately, we do have a way to catch up to that yellow circuit. The key is to create a greater number of synapses with each passing thought, and we can actually make that exponentially greater. This is achieved by loading that red circuit in written language or spoken language. Verbal acquisition and visual acquisition of our new thoughts are very powerful. This is how we can fully engage the cortex system in this fight. Writing down a preferred thought requires at least 10 times the number of synapses of simply thinking that thought alone. Why? Well, we must engage every lobe of the cerebral cortex to complete a written thought. In addition to thinking that thought, we must engage language skills, and this is huge, fine and large motor skills, sensory input, and visual input. Listening to spoken language and watching video steps that signal strength up significantly. Processing audio and video requires exponentially greater synaptic activity in our cerebral cortex. We can literally catch up 100 times faster than the speed with which the old default was built in the first place. This process is known as CAVT, Cognitive Audio-Visual Technique. Over time, and with much repetition, the new thought can be grown to the point where it can really rival the old. Even when we make use of techniques like CAVT that increase this effort exponentially, we're still going to have to contend with a large number of repetitions to catch up with that old default, in this case the yellow circuit. What can be so frustrating is that at this point in the process, we may have practiced dozens of times, but yet the old default circuit is still winning more often than not. Chalk that up to physics. But lest we be too quick to load the system, stop and think about it. You really wouldn't want it any other way. It's a very necessary thing for the stability of the brain. If our brains didn't work this way, we probably wouldn't survive. It's really quite a marvelous system. And again, it's a good security system. it prevents a meltdown. And once we get the darn things configured properly, they are much more likely to stay configured that way. In fact, we would actually have a pretty difficult time reversing that process. These next 3 slides show the new pathway beginning to gain amplitude by using CAVT. This can be accomplished by speaking these thoughts into an audio or videotape and listening to or watching them daily. Because of how much horsepower it takes to run the audio and visual processing centers in the brain, by using these techniques we can literally overload these new pathways at 100 times the speed of loading them with our thoughts alone. Another way of saying this is to say that listening to an audio and watching a video creates exponentially greater numbers of new synapses in the brain. In the world of brain function, the pathway with the greatest number of synapses is the one that ultimately gets the nod. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, estimates that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become a phenomenon. Fortunately, it doesn't take 10,000 hours of repetition to change a thought, but it does take roughly 10,000 strokes. But before you get too freaked out by that number, consider this. A practice stroke equals 1 thought in this case. If we can put 10 thoughts on a 1-minute videotape, which one can easily do, then 1 minute of video equals 10 practice strokes. If you watch that video for 10 times every day, that's a mere 10 minutes. That adds up to 100 strokes per day. So if you watch 10 minutes worth of video every day for 100 days, you arrive at 10,000 practice strokes. 3.5 months. Is that really that big of a price to pay? I can virtually guarantee that 10 minutes of practice watching a videotape with 10 perfected thoughts 100 times a day will absolutely change the way you think. If you don't believe that to be true, then I invite you to take the challenge. I've never had a client ever come back to me after 100 days and say, hey, I listened to these thoughts 10 times a day for 100 days and it did nothing. If that happens to you, you'll be the first. But I don't hold out much hope for that happening. Like most of my clients, you will instead be saying, this changes everything. I've had only 2 responses to this challenge. Those who take my challenge and are amazed, and those who don't. This slide represents approximately 10,000 repetitions. At this point, new information being processed by the brain is becoming equally as likely to travel down either pathway. At this point, I'm equally likely to think, I don't care, as I do care, a lot. Of course, we're not done at this point, but it is a significant change in thinking. At this point, you're looking at that box of donuts, and you hear your brain launching those old default thoughts. Who cares? It just doesn't matter. Go ahead and eat one. And then, distinctly loud and clear, you hear that second set of thoughts. Wait a minute. I care. It does matter. It matters tremendously. Walk away. Feel good about exercising self-discipline right now. That will feel a whole lot better than that donut would taste. This, my friend, is a very cool place to be. Now finally, on this slide, this is where the magic happens. At this point, the new thought process or perspective has officially taken over, and the old default is slowly fading away. At this point, the new way of thinking has become slightly more dominant, meaning that the brain will default to the new way of thinking. We literally have created a new default. Synapses are fairly stable, but they're not permanent. We can observe this in skeletal muscle, and it's called atrophy. Our brains follow a use it or lose it strategy. Just like muscle tissue, the brain borrows neuropeptides from unused pathways and recycles these unused chemicals in the new one. It literally borrows the hardware from the old circuit to build the new. We're still likely to hear those old default thoughts, but they will not have a strong enough impulse to influence behavior. How do we know the brain can do this? Easy. We can observe it. In someone who was sighted, meaning that they formerly could see and now has become blind, the neurons that formerly powered the eyes get recruited to power the fingertips. This actually happens naturally when a blind person learns to read Braille. We can use the same mechanism to recruit those I don't care neurons to power the new message, I do care. Now we're getting somewhere. The more we fire this red circuit by watching the videotapes, listening to the videotapes, reading, writing, the more we weaken that yellow circuit. At this stage, we're far more likely to walk away from the box of donuts because it has become relatively easy to pay attention to the thinking that supports self-control and sticking to our intentions. But the yellow circuit is not gone completely. The temptation to just go ahead and eat that donut still fires off in the brain. And there will still be times when we will just go ahead and do it. But those times will be relatively few. I like to think of this as improving a batting average. I'm never going to bat 100% or 1,000. But if I keep practicing and I maintain my skills, I will just keep getting better. This final slide represents the transformation into the world of thinking correctly about eating. The yellow circuit, the one housing our old default way of thinking, has faded to a mere whisper. What once dominated our thinking now has very little influence on our behavior. This configuration in the brain is manifested by a high degree of self-control. The donuts still look good and they still smell good, but rarely do we give in. Walking away is just what we do now. So how long does it take to get to this point? Well, if statistics are any indicator, and I believe they are, it can take 5 years to get to this point. The statistics I'm referring to are those that come from weight loss studies. Legitimate weight loss is usually referred to as those that have lost weight and kept it off for 5 years. 5 years seems to be that threshold that signifies a permanent change in behavior. So although we can reach an initial threshold in 100 days, it is most advisable to continue with regular practice strokes for at least 5 years. I like to think of these practice strokes as paying my insurance premiums. I want to insure my efforts, so I continue paying my premiums. My hope with this demonstration is to take some of the mystery out of the process of change by introducing you to a bit of neurobiology. The more I learn about the human brain personally, the more fascinated I become. Understanding the fundamentals of brain function has made all of the difference for me when it comes to change, and my goal is to pass some of that understanding along to you. As they say, knowledge is power. And if we're going to effectively make changes to our thinking, we need all the power we can get. So, thank you for watching this video, and see you on the skinny side.